Thank you, Thayer, my treasured and much missed colleague. She's still at the Met, but I'm not. And yes, you did. There was not a typographical error. She has worked there since 1989. If that's hard to believe, she brought her Dartmouth daughter here to prove that it's possible. I left the Met and immediately aged 25 years. It's extraordinary. Stephanie, Byron, superintendent, and of course Thayer. It's such an honor to be here today. I'm glad I had the opportunity to meet your governor as well, who really knows her Lincoln, I will say. 16 years ago, I hope you'll excuse the obvious construct there, it was March 1860, at the very start of a long ago presidential election year, that Abraham Lincoln made his first and, as it turned out, his only visit to New Hampshire. We know what brought him here. After making a sensational debut in New York City with an address at Cooper Union, news reached New England Republican leaders that Lincoln planned to head north for a reunion with his eldest son. I know you've heard him described as his last surviving son, which is true, but picture him at the time as a student at the Phillips Academy at Exeter. They had been separated for a few months for the first time, and Lincoln was determined to see him. As a result, invitations poured in from this region. Lincoln was asked to speak at 14 additional venues. He accepted 11, 4 in this state alone: Concord, Manchester, Dover, and Exeter, at each of which he went on to deliver a kind of a triumphant reprise of the Cooper Union address, which has been called by many historians, including me, I will acknowledge, although I'm going to change my mind now, the speech that made Abraham Lincoln president. In fact, it's more accurate, and what better time or place to say that, to acknowledge that all of these speeches, Cooper Union and the 11 that followed in New England, made Lincoln president. And Lincoln well knew the significance of these opportunities. Yet for generations, legend held that Lincoln accepted these New England engagements reluctantly. After Cooper Union, he wanted nothing more. The story went to see Robert. He agreed to speak only to help out local Republicans. And since lusting for office was not considered a virtue in the Victorian age, Lincoln himself fueled the myth. Words like weary and toil crept into his rather exaggerated correspondence from the road. Eventually, Robert bought into this legend, and so did the biographers. One went so far as to argue that there, and I quote, there was not more than a secondary thought of self in all of Lincoln's New England speeches. Well, as Lincoln once said, you can fool some of the people all of the time, even historians. And I think such naive appraisals underestimate Lincoln's political acumen and his political ambition, and he had plenty of both. He toured Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire for one reason only: to pick off delegates to the upcoming Republican National Convention by proving in New England, as he had in New York, that a Western-style stump speaker could hold his own in Yankee territory. In other words, his eyes were firmly fixed from the beginning on the prize, and the prize was the White House. And the road to the White House, then as now, runs through New Hampshire. So how did Lincoln do here? Well, no transcript survives of his first speech at Concord, but the local paper did praise what it called his irresistible logical force and power. In Manchester, the New Hampshire Mirror reported he displayed more shrewdness, more knowledge of the masses of mankind than any other public speaker we have ever heard. In Dover, he spoke for 2 full hours, and a paper said would have held his audience had he spoken all night. My favorite of the New Hampshire stories comes out of Exeter, from one of Robert Lincoln's school chums. Like a typical teenager, Robert was embarrassed about having his sophisticated pals at prep school see his rather rustic father, right? 'Twas ever thus. And at first glance, for good reason. When Lincoln appeared on stage at Town Hall, this is what the friend caustically jotted down. His hair was rumpled. His neckwear was all awry. He sat bent in his chair and altogether presented a very disappointing appearance. We sat and stared at Mr. Lincoln, and we whispered to each other, "Isn't it too bad Bob's father is so homely? Don't you feel sorry for him?" And then the eyewitness goes on. Once Lincoln untangled those long legs from his chair, drew himself up to his full height, and launched into his speech. Not 10 minutes passed before his uncouth appearance was absolutely forgotten by us boys. His face lighted up, and the man was changed. It seemed like absolutely another person talking to us. There was no more pity for our friend Bob. We were proud of his father. Such appraisals echoed from one New Hampshire venue to the next, always beginning with shock at the initial sight of Lincoln. And I've researched these records. He was grotesque, said one. He was uncouth. His ears stuck out. His voice was unkempt. His voice was hard to hear. His accent was hard to understand. Somehow, after 10 minutes, and it's interesting, observer after observer uses 10 minutes. That's the magic moment when all of that ephemeral stuff is forgotten and the magic happens. One observer recalled his eyes glistened with the fervor of his own enthusiasm. The lines of his homely face disappeared, and his wit cut like a Damascus blade. Probably not politically correct today, but there you go. That was 1860. To be sure, not every observer fell under his spell, and that's important to remember. Newspapers of the day were creatures of political parties, and Democratic journals here had nothing good to say about the Republican visitor. One even charged that Lincoln wanted to substitute Nashua as a venue because Manchester offered him only $50 to talk, which was half his minimum fee for a lecture. Yes, Lincoln aroused controversy in the 1860 campaign because he had taken big honorariums for his speeches. Think about that. Some things don't change, right? Often, the partisan criticism could get truly personal and provocative. Another Democratic paper here listens to Lincoln and claims in print that in his speech, and I quote, Mr. Lincoln apologized for the slovenliness of his personal appearance and for not having changed his linen, and then proceeded to enlighten the people in New England with regard to the superiority of the African race over that of the Anglo-Saxon, meant to provoke, unsettle, and upset. Of course, Lincoln did no such things. What he advocated here in New England was confronting slavery, inequality, by banning its spread into the Western territories in order to place it, as he put it, on the course of ultimate extinction. Yet one New Hampshire Democratic paper thought that that restriction alone was a recipe for secession. Opposing slavery's spread in any shape or form, the paper warned, would split the Union into pieces, baffling the skill of our modern Republican artists to combine it again. Now that's an imperfect but irresistible transition into a crucial chapter of the story of the rest of Lincoln's campaign for president, and in fact, a piece that had preceded it. Remember, as much as his appearance may have startled his New England audiences, Lincoln knew better than his contemporaries how he looked. Famously accused in a debate once of being two-faced, he looked at his opponent and said, "If I had another face, do you think I would wear this one?" Self-deprecate. There we go. This is going to be in and out, so bear with me. Self-deprecating stories like that abound in the Lincoln literature. My favorite is another one that he liked to tell on himself. So he's riding alone in the woods one day, he liked to say, came upon a truly hideous-looking fellow who lifted his rifle and aimed it right at Lincoln's chest. "Stop, my friend. What on earth are you doing?" said Lincoln. "Stranger," the man replied, "I always vowed that if I ever met a man uglier than myself, I would shoot him on the spot." And Lincoln looked at him and replied, Friend, if I am uglier than you, then fire away. I feel like I'm preaching to the converted here with Father Abraham in the audience. Now, what is truly remarkable, I think, about such stories is not just that Lincoln was secure enough to tell them on himself, but that while mocking his own appearance whenever he spoke, he was simultaneously making sure that the inner strength was being captured by artists in all media. Within weeks of his visit east, Lincoln was in high demand for artists back in Illinois and was consistently delighted and eager to oblige them. The trend started on that very 1860 trip east. Do we have power? Yeah. You need to hang close. Okay. The trip, it's great. Lincoln never used a microphone, and he managed beautifully. There's something to be said for that. So just hours before taking the stage at Cooper Union, he visited the photography studio of the now legendary Matthew Brady, posing for a likeness that proved as important as the speech in propelling his candidacy. He stood there before the cameras. Brady said, "Can you pull up your shirt collar?" And Lincoln said, "Oh, I see you want to shorten my neck." And Brady said, "That's it exactly." So he gave a tug. The picture was taken, well, not quite in a snap. And the result made Lincoln look like a statesman. Brady in the Cooper Union, Lincoln later said, made me president. Indeed, the photo was reproduced in prints, posters, badges, banners, broadsides so often it came to serve as a surrogate for the candidate, because after delivering his final New England speech in 1860, Lincoln gave not a single additional campaign speech during the entire race to come. It just wasn't done. Like openly partisan newspapers, silence by presidential campaigns was another hallmark of the Lincoln era. How many people would vote to return? Well, we won't do that. So what was an incurable campaigner to do in a political environment in which personal appearance was important, but personal appearances were forbidden? Appear before the people in photography, art, sculpture. Only a few weeks after returning from New England, he visited the Chicago studio of a sculptor named Leonard Volk, where he sat for a life mask, a process he described as anything but agreeable. Little wonder the sculptor inserted straws in his nose, covered his face in wet plaster, he had gauze on his eyes, and then waited a half hour or more for the plaster to harden, and then tried to get the mask off, and it wouldn't come off. Lincoln had to take his strong hands and tug and pull at the mask, and in the process it pulled out some hairs in his temple areas. He wasn't bearded then, and tears came involuntarily to his eyes. You would think that after that he would write off sitting for sculptors. But a month later he returned to the very same studio, this time to sit for a bust portrait. And he stayed even after Volk surprised him. Now, this is a man who has only posed for the life mask, never for another sculpture. Volk asked him to shed his coat and vest, remove his shirt and tie, and even pull down the Union suit he wore underneath so the sculptor might capture what he called his breast and brawny shoulders. Lincoln stayed. He was so embarrassed, though, that once the sitting was ended, he quickly dressed and fled into the street without another word. He had walked several blocks before a passerby alerted him to the fact that the sleeves from his underwear were dangling from his coattails and trailing along the sidewalk. In his haste to depart, he had neglected to slip back into his Union suit. He not only had to go back to Volk's studio, he had to ask Volk to help, as he put it, rearrange him. But the result proved worth the ordeal. When Lincoln saw the finished bust based on the life mask, he burst out in appreciation. There is the animal himself. High praise from Abraham Lincoln. And there was more to come. In May, the very day after Lincoln won the Republican nomination for president, Volk showed up at the candidate's home to ask him to submit to new plaster castings, this time of his hands. He now wanted to make a statue of Lincoln holding a scroll. He needed hands. But Lincoln's right paw was swollen from a long night of congratulatory handshaking. To mask the puffiness, Volk suggested that Lincoln grip some household object. The candidate retreated to his backyard, and Volk soon heard the loud sound of a saw cutting through wood. When Lincoln reappeared, he was whittling away at the stump of a broom handle he had amputated outside, and he was rounding it off. "Please don't bother," Volk said. "The ends don't have to be smooth. It's only a prop." Lincoln was disappointed. He was now into this whole ordeal. "Oh, well," he said, "I thought I would like to have it look nice." Overall, as a subject for the artists and sculptors, Lincoln truly had it nicer than he deserved. No politician ever made himself so readily available or benefited so handsomely, and I use that word on purpose, from images that flooded the country and made a virtue, not a negative, of his rugged appearance. Were the depictions accurate? Not many. Perhaps that's why we still treasure Volk's life casts above all other representations, just as Lincoln did. They are the real thing, the animal himself, the best source. Perhaps it was artistic insight then, or destiny, or both, that the New England tour that propelled Lincoln toward the presidency also inspired Volk to invite him to his studio, and subsequently Volk's life, mask, and hands that inspired and informed Augustus Saint-Gaudens in modeling his own incomparable sculptures of Lincoln. We know that he saw Lincoln. Thayer has told you that. I just want to point out, in being part of a crowd when Lincoln came through New York City in 1861 as president-elect was not like waiting on a line of reverential mourners to view his remains. Lincoln won 30% of the vote in New York City in 1860. Newspaper after newspaper reported that his carriage rode down Broadway toward the City Hall area in almost utter silence. Saint-Gaudens saw something that others didn't. The rugged man, the dark man, bowing and trying to take measure of the crowd. Walt Whitman was in the same crowd and thought that it was a good thing that someone did not have a knife or pistol on that sullen day. That's all I want to say about the art part, because Thayer, as always, has done it beautifully. That's why I concentrated on the Lincoln image itself. But I don't want to emphasize image alone at the expense of message. So just allow me to spend a few more minutes recalling the words that Lincoln spoke in New England in 1860, because they're important. His was not a radical message. He did not advocate political revolution. He was too realistic politically. He understood the process too well. He knew slavery was enshrined in the Constitution and that its advocates would cling to that guarantee, perhaps to the death. Slavery was an evil, he argued here. It had to die, but it had to be eradicated gradually for fear of destroying the entire country in the process. It was not an altogether popular message for progressives in New England. But he explained his position through homespun metaphor. To favor immediate abolition would be as dangerous as excising a malignant tumor, but allowing a patient to bleed to death in the process. Or like finding a venomous snake in your children's bed and striking at the serpent so reflexively that the snake bit your child before it died. Disdaining the idea of upheaval, Lincoln advocated leaving slavery alone where it had long existed, but choking it off from further expansion. Forbid its spread. What would that do? Will you wait for new Western territories to organize as states? They send anti-slavery senators and congressmen to Washington. They achieve a supermajority to amend the Constitution, and eventually slavery would end. Until then, he said, never let the advocates of slavery forget that their position was wrong and the opponents of slavery right. That was Lincoln's New York, New Hampshire, New England message. It's one of the terrible ironies of history that even his moderate approach, just as that New England newspaper predicted, aroused such violent opposition in the South that the mere fact of his election proved sufficient to provoke secession, the conciliatory message of his inaugural address insufficient to prevent rebellion. In a sense, Lincoln became a hero in spite of himself. As he put it in that same speech that Governor Hassan quoted, he had to rise to the occasion. The homely, self-effacing giant who made sure the visual arts introduced him to voters and enshrined him as an American icon. The cautious politician who, in the end, was willing to sacrifice a staggering 750,000 American lives, the equivalent of about 11 million people in today's population, to secure a new birth of freedom. Some of the ideas he fought for took real shape here in New England. In fact, he went further here than he had in New York. Between speeches, he visited a Manchester textile mill where he came face to face with a harsh reality that free men in the North sometimes profited from cotton harvested by enslaved men in the South. His delayed but unforgettable response came later in the second inaugural when he described slavery as an offense for which North and South alike bore guilt. And during his visit, he openly supported striking New England shoe workers, declaring, "I am glad there is a system of labor where the laborer can strike if he wants to. Without it, slavery comes in, and free labor that can strike will give way to slave labor that cannot." What made America truly free, he said, was its promise of opportunity, giving what he called the humblest man an equal chance to get rich with everybody else. When one starts poor, he said, as most do in the race of life, free society is such that he knows that there is no fixed condition of labor for his whole life. Here was Lincoln's response to income inequality, a fair chance in the race of life. Lincoln came here in March with almost no chance of changing long-time political allegiances. Yet when convention votes were cast just 2 months later, enough New England delegates did go over to Lincoln on the second and third ballots to put him over the top. He moved no delegates from New York, despite all the razzle-dazzle of Cooper Union. New Hampshire moved delegates. It's very interesting. Perhaps they appreciated that wherever he went that winter, in those first speeches here and those last speeches of his campaign for president, Lincoln closed every oration with a rousing version of the same inspiring lines he had introduced at Cooper Union. Words, one eyewitness remembered, that always evoked the wildest enthusiasm, and words that I think are especially well worth remembering today. "Neither let us be slandered from our duty by false accusations against us, nor frightened from it by menaces of destruction to the government, nor of dungeons to ourselves. Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it." In dedicating an earlier bronze statue of Lincoln in Washington back in 1876, the great abolitionist leader Frederick Douglass remembered the right behind Lincoln's might, and he spoke for many of the freedmen who had financed its casting by urging Americans in the future, multiply his statues, hang his pictures high. Today, Cornish heeds that advice in an extraordinary way. Even amidst what we'd call the venom of a modern political campaign that Lincoln would recognize from the 1860 campaign, but perhaps surprises us in its virulence today, in which, by the way, both presidential candidates have freely quoted Abraham Lincoln for months, and yet a campaign so notably devoid in one part of the idea of malice toward none and charity for all. Today, Cornish reminds us that perhaps the best way we can honor the greatest of our presidents and the greatest of his statues is by remembering, again and always, some other famous words, that a house divided against itself really cannot stand. Or from another speech that binding up the nation's wounds, not rubbing salt into them, should be a national aspiration. And by recalling again the adage with which Lincoln concluded all of his 1860 speeches in New Hampshire, right really does make might, and not the other way around. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.